Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robin Wright. I'm a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. I am really delighted and honored to have Doug Lute here to join us this afternoon for a conversation on wars of the future and the wars of today. Doug is a unique person. He is a scholar, a soldier, a policymaker, and a diplomat. And to find that level of competence with that long a career and working for both Republican and Democratic administrations is rare, if not totally unique. Doug is a graduate of West Point and Harvard. He served in the military for 35 years, rising to the rank of lieutenant general. He was director of operations at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, running military operations worldwide. He also was a policymaker, serving at the National Security Council under both Presidents Bush and President Obama. And most recently, he was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, the world's largest military alliance. So we're going to talk, have a conversation for a half hour, 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So let's begin with the elephant in the room, and that is NATO obsolete?
Well, first of all, thanks to USIP. I think most of you probably turned out to see Robin, not me, but I come to listen to Robin as well. So we have that in common. It's good to be back in the States, and this is one of my first opportunities. I left government on January 20th, and having settled back in with my family here in Arlington, it's nice to be back and have an opportunity to do events like this. So thanks to USIP for the invitation. So I think if someone calls NATO obsolete, that person has missed about 25 years of recent history. If obsolescence was what NATO was in the Cold War, it's important to remember that the Cold War ended in '89, '91, and I think NATO went through a very fundamental adaptation in that period. In fact, President Obama at the Warsaw Summit last summer referred to a pivotal moment. And he said that today NATO is at a pivotal moment. I think the only other moment like today was that period, '89 to '91, where after 40 years of the Cold War, NATO fundamentally changed. It did a couple things. First of all, it changed politically. It went from, in that period, 16 allies. Today there are 28. So it enlarged politically. It opened its doors to former Warsaw Treaty members, former Soviet socialist republics like the 3 Baltic states, and welcomed them into the community of democratic nations hinged on democratic values, which is what the alliance is all about. So it changed politically. It also opened its doors by way of partnerships, so not membership, but partnerships to 40 other countries. So it started at the end of the Cold War with a mere 16, sort of hunkered down behind the sandbags of the Cold War. And a few years later, 16 became 28, and no partners became 40 partners. Among the partners, every Soviet Socialist Republic and Russia itself. That's pretty fundamental political change over a period of about 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. And it certainly shows, that kind of adaptation certainly shows not an obsolete organization that's stuck in the past, but really one that's got its head up, is paying attention, and is contributing. Now, NATO's military alliance, it also changed militarily. After 40 years of the Cold War, which was absolutely anchored in collective defense. I mean, I grew up, and I suspect there are others in the audience who grew up in the U.S. military or in the U.S. diplomatic corps, in Western Europe at that time. This was all about the collective defense of Western Europe. I mean, that was the raison d'etre of NATO from its origins in 1949. At the end of the Cold War, though, NATO realized it didn't need to have 300,000 American troops in Germany defending a border which no longer existed. And so it adapted. Fundamentally, the U.S. adapted, and 300,000 U.S. troops today became 30,000. So we decreased by, you know, my math fails me here, but a lot, 90%, right? And so we did not stay anchored in the military posture of the Cold War. We changed. with the military forces that remained in NATO, we took our show on the road. So Soviet Union dissolves in 91. By 95, 4 years later, 60,000 NATO troops go to Bosnia. 2 years after that, 50,000 into Kosovo. After 9/11, NATO joined us in Afghanistan. In fact, that's really significant because if NATO were obsolete, it seems a little peculiar to me that an alliance that was designed to defend Western Europe against the Soviets, right, actually invoked its collective defense clause not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with Western European allies supporting us, and the attack was not in Western Europe, but it was here across the river, and it was in New York City, and it wasn't by the Soviets, it was by something called Al-Qaeda. Now, an obsolete organization wouldn't pull off those kinds of adaptations on the political front and on the military front. So I deny this notion of obsolescence. It doesn't mean, by the way, that NATO should rest on its laurels. No meaningful organization, not USIP, not the US government, not NATO, can afford to just sit back and let events wash over it. So there's more adaptation to take place, and we can talk about that. But I am quite adamant that NATO is not obsolete. It's up to the task. It has adapted before, and it's in the midst of further adaptation now.
Can you talk a little bit about...
All my answers won't be that long.
No, I hope they are. It's very thoughtful. How is the U.S. role in NATO evolving? How is it adapting either to the changing nature of threats, or the role that our partners are willing to absorb?
Well, the first fundamental change, if we're still adapting, as I suggested, the first fundamental change at this strategic inflection point, or Obama's pivotal moment, has to do with responding to a newly aggressive Russia, to NATO's east, and to a whole host of very complex challenges to the south, to NATO's south geographically. So this is the ISIL challenge to the south. This is mass illegal migration from the south. This is unstable neighborhood to the south, ranging from a bit by extension Afghanistan, through the Arabian Peninsula, through the Middle East, and across the northern flank of Africa. So the challenges here for NATO today are very different. If you look geographically to the east, with Crimea and Donbass, Russian military posture, nuclear saber rattling, and all that, and if you look to the south, which is this sort of potpourri of terrorism, migration, and instability. So to the east, NATO's taken some very fundamental steps in the last 2 years, and that's why I marked the last 2 years as a point similar to 89-91 in NATO's long history. Since 2014, and the illegal seizing of Crimea and the destabilizing of the Donbass in Ukraine, NATO's taken the following adaptive steps. Okay, number one, it has turned the corner on defense spending. I mean, some people would like to claim responsibility. My staff worked very hard to get to the point where we built the political consensus to reverse the trend in declining defense spending. And now NATO defense spending is making real increases for the first time in like 20 years. But it wasn't my staff. It wasn't me. It wasn't my staff. It wasn't the Obama administration. It was Vladimir Putin. Okay? Vladimir Putin was responsible for this fundamental adaptation in the spending habits of our 28 NATO allies. And we can go into more details there about that. So that's pretty fundamental adaptation. These are national treasury dollars that are now being committed to increasing defense capability across the 28 allies. That's pretty fundamental. The second thing is NATO is today, and Americans are today, deploying where they have never deployed before. And this is across the eastern flank of NATO, geographically ranging from Estonia and the Baltics all the way down to Bulgaria on the Black Sea. And we have a NATO presence. There are NATO flags flying for the first time in NATO's history in these eastern flank allies. You know, over the last 20 years, we didn't think we needed to deploy forces there. Why? Because we had Russia as a partner, right? And we were in meetings with Russia. There's a Russian delegation to NATO. There was a few weeks ago, I had a Russian counterpart, Alexander Grushko, Ambassador Alexander Grushko, and we were in partnership. We thought for 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we thought we could craft a political partnership. But that has very much changed in the last couple years. So we've now deployed forces where they were never deployed before. To the south, NATO is in the business of counterterrorism in a very fundamental way. You know, most of the press, most of the attention goes to the 65-nation international coalition, which is not NATO, right? But this is the U.S.-led coalition, hosted now by, or run now by Brett McGurk over in the State Department and others. But what people miss is that NATO, the 28 member states of NATO, are the force provider for that counter-ISIL coalition. All 28 allies today contribute forces to the 65. Beyond that, about 20 additional partner states also contribute. So the majority of the counter-ISIL coalition contributors have NATO roots. How is it that you can put together on the fly an international coalition like that, and it's actually more dangerous to the enemy than it is to themselves, right? How is it they can be militarily effective? It's because they've done this before in NATO exercises, in NATO schoolhouses, and on NATO battlefields, like in Afghanistan. So in a sort of indirect way, and in the sort of shadows of the coalition, you have NATO providing forces and NATO providing the interoperability, the effectiveness of those forces that drives the counter-ISIL coalition. Finally, NATO is contributing a couple very sort of niche capabilities. One is we're flying AWACS planes. This is airborne early warning and air command and control aircraft over Turkey, and we're providing that air picture to the coalition out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. NATO has a training mission in Iraq. So NATO's back into the mission of training Iraqi soldiers on categories of tasks that Prime Minister al-Abadi has asked us to do. So we are side by side with the coalition in terms of building Iraqi capability. Third, we've gone to other states in the region outside of Iraq, which we believe are at risk because they live in bad neighborhoods. So Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, and we're providing training and assistance there. So NATO is very active. It's not much in the press, but it's very much in the action, both in the south and to the east. So some pretty fundamental adaptations. When you add that up, I make the point that the only other time since 1949 that NATO has adapted, has been charged to change its fundamentals as it is today, was the fall of the Berlin Wall, 89-91. And I think we're at another pivotal moment or inflection point now in NATO's long history. It's just we're too close to it right now, right? I mean, when you're into fundamental change like this, sometimes it escapes you, and you need a couple years of perspective before it becomes obvious. But I'm giving you a heads up. I think we're at a pivotal moment.
I want to ask you about both Russia and ISIS/Al-Qaeda. Let me begin with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Americans identify ISIS as the greatest national security threat. Clearly, our European allies feel that much more immediately with all the attacks. And as you point out, NATO was involved in its first deployment outside Europe in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda. Take a look at the broader issue of extremism as this administration has, and what more can NATO do in fighting the idea? I mean, maybe it can't do anything. What more can the member states, how can they pool their resources politically, diplomatically, in social media, whatever, to deal with this threat, which is likely to be around for a long time? And particularly when you look at how ISIS may evolve post-caliphate, how Al-Qaeda may resurge, as many fear, because it's embedded more effectively than ISIS has. And how can it adapt down the road in dealing with what is likely to be our top security threat for the foreseeable future?
Well, my first response, Robin, is that we could do more of what we're doing now. So yes, we have a training mission in Iraq, for example, but look, the training mission in Iraq is a multi-decade problem. This is not something where Mosul, so now the big fight, the shiny object is the liberating of Mosul. Okay, well, that's going to happen, but the Iraqi forces are going to need help and assistance for, pick a number of decades, a couple decades anyway. So NATO can move into that space as the coalition moves elsewhere and can take on some of the institution building and take the long-term perspective in investing in Iraqi capacity. So we're tailor-made to do that. We should do that. But actually, there's a tougher chore, I think, at hand for NATO allies. And that is because the ISIL threat internal to NATO, so here in the United States, as one of the member states, but in Paris, in Brussels, I mean, the Brussels airport 2 miles from my office in NATO headquarters was bombed last March, right? But there have been ISIL-sponsored attacks or related attacks in other allied states as well. Germany, for example, has suffered. France has suffered a number. The big issue there, I think, is that you're not going to see NATO troops as NATO patrolling the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But you're going to see French troops on the streets of France. And NATO, however, while it doesn't deploy under a NATO flag into these internal situations, I mean, I don't think there's any need for our military to be patrolling our streets, by the way, much less French military patrolling American streets. Those are internal security issues. The first thing we should do there is be much more facile in sharing intelligence than we are. And we should use the NATO intelligence backbone, which was designed for the Cold War. It was adapted for these out-of-area missions, like in Afghanistan. It could be used today to share internal security intelligence. And we have the machinery, we have the classification system, we have the distribution, all the protocols are there. We should be doing better in terms of NATO as the backbone of sharing intelligence among the 28 allies, and also reaching out to some of these 40 partners I mentioned as well. So Sweden, Finland, Austria are all in this network. It defied me for 3 years as the permanent representative to NATO. We couldn't get more intelligence pressed through this intelligence pipeline. So that's one thing, if I were still there in Brussels working this issue, that would be high on my list. But there's one even more fundamental. I think it's very important as we take on this internal security challenge that NATO serves as a bastion, as a standard bearer for democratic values. We cannot respond to this threat in a way that is self-defeating, because we drift away from what we really believe and who we really are. In fact, I'm sure all of you carry, like I do, the Washington Treaty, okay? You got to read halfway down this thing before you get to the part about an attack on one is an attack on all, right? But you only have to read the second sentence to understand what underpins NATO. Founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. That's the bedrock of NATO, those values. So as we respond to this threat, to which NATO as a military alliance is not ideally suited to respond militarily, right? The thing we have to do, and NATO is a very important forum to remind ourselves, the 28 of us, that we are bound by certain democratic values. And if we drift from these values, first, we will not be effective against ISIL, because ISIL and others like ISIL will use that drift away from our values against us, right? But second of all, we won't be true to ourselves. And we will place the alliance at risk. So there's some things we can do kind of on the margin militarily. I think intel sharing is a very practical initiative. But I think even more fundamental is this question of values. So be true to who we are. Be true to what we signed up for. And among these 28 democracies, hold ourselves to account. No drift on the values.
I'm actually surprised to hear you say that we could share more intelligence. Do you have a feeling that there's a reluctance among any of the allies to share what they know 15, 16 years after the 9/11 attacks?
So intelligence sharing, and there's probably others in the room who are more expert at this than me, but as a practitioner, right, as a consumer of intelligence, right, the protocols for sharing intelligence have been built up over years and years, decades and decades, and tend to feature a rather exclusionary approach to sharing intelligence. So if there's a challenge in a particular allied country, yes, we're going to share intelligence with that ally. But it tends to be done bilaterally or in small exclusive groups. What I'm suggesting is that we should open those pipes, and not for tactical intelligence. You know, like terrorist X is believed to be in the third floor apartment at the intersection of Street 1 and Street 2. That's of no interest to an ally 4 countries away, right? But intelligence that reflects the broad trends of the movement. So you have the core of ISIL in Iraq and Syria. What about the 8 franchises? How are they doing? What's the U.S. intelligence assessment of the relationship between the franchises and the core? What happens, what's the U.S. analysis of what happens when Mosul and Raqqa are, as they say, liberated and no longer in the physical control of ISIL? So what's the next phase look like? These are not things that involve tactical, internal security, or police actions, right? But they're more operational and strategic. That's the analysis that we should be sharing now. So that when we come to that next phase against ISIL, and there will be a next phase and a phase after that, this is going to be a long-term problem, and it may not be called ISIL. It may be called son of ISIL or whatever. When we come to that, we have a base of 28 like-minded nations that have shared their analysis and therefore have a basis for action. And we don't have to start from scratch because the initiative rests with the enemy. So that's the intelligence. I'm talking about higher level intelligence, which I think we can be more inclusive and more sharing.
But do you have a sense that there's anyone in the alliance that's not sharing vital intelligence with us?
So I don't really have an opinion on that. I suppose that because the protocols today are not in place among all 28, and because of this sort of intelligence sharing bias, which is only need to know, right? I suspect that's the case, but I don't have any hard evidence of that.
Yeah. All right, so let's turn to Russia. Relations have been particularly fraught since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And this month marks the 10th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, right, when he talked...
this week.
This week, that's right.
Munich is later this week.
In which he blamed the United States for instability in the Middle East because of its clumsy handling of the Iraq War, for undermining international order by its expansion into the Baltics and provoking an arms race with its development of missile defense. President Trump has repeatedly talked about bettering relations with Russia. How realistic do you think that is? How do you, when you look down the road at the basic differences we have with Russia, how do you kind of project into the future?
Well, look, from NATO's perspective, this is a pretty clean-cut answer. That is that Russia fundamentally tore up the rule book in the seizing of Crimea and the overt semi-proxy destabilizing of the Donbass. I mean, this breaks the fundamental rules of the road in the world, yes, but certainly in Western Europe, which had suffered so much from past experiences of violating sovereignty and violating international borders and so forth. We've lived under those rules now for some time. And even basically during the Cold War, we sort of abided by these rules. I mean, these rules go all the way back at least to the UN Charter. But through the Helsinki Agreement, through the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was an agreement between NATO and Russia about the rules of the road and so forth, right? So the rule book was ripped apart with the seizing of Ukrainian territory, the Crimea, 3 years ago? In fact, 3 years ago this month. So there's no disputing that. And there's no collaborating, there's no accommodating that basic fact, okay? And NATO is not going to get over this, okay? This is not something that NATO is going to forget. Why? Because borders and sovereignty are fundamental to keeping Europe on the peaceful side of the equation. That's fundamentally an American interest too. And I think, obviously, since the end of World War II, that's been the big project in Europe. So on that side, there's no accommodating. But there are a lot of other issues on which we should be searching for common ground with Russia. So let me just, cite a couple examples. Counterterrorism. We should be sharing one of the ISIL franchises is in the North Caucasus. There are Russian citizens today fighting under ISIL's flag in Syria and Iraq. So Russia's got skin in this game, not to mention its obvious activities in Western Syria. That's an issue. Afghanistan. Russia's got an interest in stabilizing Central Asia. Most of the Central Asian states, many of the Central Asian states were at one time Soviet Socialist republics, not Afghanistan, but Russia's got its own history in Afghanistan as well. So it's got an interest in those, for Russia, those southern flank Central Asian states that is a fundamental concern for Russia. Look, an American astronaut today doesn't get into space unless we find a way to cooperate with Russia, because they fly on Russian rockets, right? Think about Assad and the disposal of his chemical arsenal. That project, right, which, by the way, the results of that project, the impact of that project should be very evident to us today. What if Assad, I almost said Saddam, what if Assad today had his full chemical arsenal? Well, he doesn't, because the Western alliance and Russia cooperated and got that stuff out of Syria and disposed of it safely. So there's a lot of areas where we should be open to cooperation with Russia. Now, all of those may seem a long way away, right? And it's sort of a bridge too far. It's just too difficult. There's some very practical near-term steps that NATO is working with Russia to try to accomplish. Number one, transparency. You know, I described that we're deploying forces now where they've never been before. Well, when we deploy those forces into the eastern flank nations of NATO, we're deploying them closer to Russia. We have been completely transparent with who's going where, with what strength, and so forth. And what we ask of our Russian colleagues is they be equally transparent. They be reciprocal, right? So Defense Minister Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, claimed that he was going to respond with NATO's commitment by creating 3 new divisions in the Western Military District. Well, we would like to know more about these 3 divisions. Where are they going to be? What strength are they going to be? When will they be? So we would like a reciprocal exchange of information so that what we're doing is actually portrayed accurately. It's not amplified. It's not distorted. And we would like equally to have confidence in what Russia's doing. Another case in point is risk reduction. There have been, over the last couple years, a number of very dangerous close encounters of military aircraft with our military aircraft, Russians' aircraft with our aircraft, Russian aircraft buzzing our fleet, and in all cases in international airspace, in international seas, right? And we've so far avoided a shooting match. But when a Russian fighter comes over the horizon in the Baltic Sea and closes to one of our ships at a distance the width of this room, at several hundred knots per hour, you can imagine that the captain of that ship, of that U.S. ship in the Baltic Sea, has a matter of seconds to figure out whether this is game day or this is just harassment. And we can continue to rely on the professionalism of our forces and hope that they don't misjudge one of these incidents. But, you know, humans are flawed and accidents happen. And so that kind of activity we should put a stop to. We should agree that this is irresponsible behavior, and that if these are rogue pilots, then they should be held accountable. If they're not rogue pilots, and this is a matter of policy, then change the policy. So in both transparency and in risk reduction, there are some very prudent and, I think, immediate steps that we ought to be taking. And by the way, those are the 2 key topics in which we engage the Russian mission to NATO day to day. And that's why there is a Russian mission to NATO.
I was in Russia last week, and just on your point about the number of fighters, Russian fighters who have joined ISIS, the official Russian estimate is 5,000, but Russian officials told me on background that it was probably twice that, and that's very telling. I want to press you, though. You talked about NATO's position on Russia. But President Trump has taken a much friendlier tone when it comes to Russia. Is the United States, or is this administration, breaking from, in any way, small or large, from the NATO position on Russia? Do you think it is kind of out of sync with the fears of most of our European allies?
Well, here I'd separate rhetoric, much of which trails from the campaign days, and however, on January 20th, rhetoric becomes, we move into the realm of policy, right? So I think it's too soon in the policy arena to judge that there's any disconnect. I mean, I'm heartened by the testimonies of Secretary Mattis, now Secretary Tillerson. One of the first calls that Jim Mattis made on this first duty day as Secretary of Defense was to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg of NATO. So he went on the record very early on the morning of the first day by picking up the phone and calling NATO. He'll be, by the way, Jim Mattis will be, I think I mentioned, in Brussels this week for his first ministers' meeting. So this is the 28 defense ministers all come together roughly quarterly. And I expect a strong statement there. I think it's now public that Vice President Pence will go to Munich and attend the Munich Security Conference. And I think we'll get a very good plug there for the importance of our European allies and so forth. So I think it's too soon to tell. I haven't seen any policy actions that put this administration at odds with NATO. There have been some early rhetoric which seems a little discordant, but actually some of that rhetoric as well has been sort of moderated and moved into the mainstream. So far so good, and I'm not ready to judge based on what, 2.5 weeks of administration time.
Okay, so I want to look at Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's begin with Iraq. When you were in the Bush administration, well, when you were at the Joint Chiefs, you delivered a message on behalf of the Joint Chiefs to President Bush that there was skepticism and less than total support for the idea of a surge of U.S. troops. Not because the military didn't think it couldn't manage or achieve its goals, but because of concern that the political framework might not, or the political solutions necessary to make all Iraqis feel they were included and represented in the political process would be achieved. And, in the end, the Joint Chiefs have turned out to be right. The Iraqi government did not do what it took to reform the political system to include its various ethnic and religious minorities. And 13 years later, it's kind of a deja vu that we're facing the same kind of militant or extremist challenge, and the Iraqi government 13 years later still hasn't taken those steps. How worried are you about the future of Iraq? Let's say we do manage to liberate Mosul, to force ISIS out of Iraq, that we may face the same kind of challenges, the same vulnerability of the system, and even less ability at this stage to produce a convincing solution that will make people want to hold Iraq together. I mean, how worried are you about Iraq's future?
So you remind me of those days in, late 2006. So President Bush commissioned, things in Iraq were grim, right? So President Bush commissions an interagency study in Iraq led by J.D. Crouch, the Deputy National Security Advisor. The Joint Staff participated in that, so I had the Joint Staff Chair along with John Sattler, the J5. And you're right, the Joint Chiefs' position on that policy question, should we surge or are there other adaptations we should make to turn the tide in Iraq, did not favor a surge. And in fact, neither did the field commander, General Casey, nor General Abizaid, the CENTCOM commander at the time. Why was that the position of the uniformed military at that time? So part of the answer was the one you mentioned. There wasn't confidence that this surge in military activity would lead to a counterpart progress in the Iraqi political situation. And so the concern was you could surge, and you could certainly have a tactical, localized, temporary impact, which in fact the surge did have, right? So we surged 30,000 American troops. Went to 20 combat brigades in Iraq, 170,000 total troops, and it had a effect. It did tamp down the violence, especially the violence in the center of gravity, which was Baghdad. And to this, I give credit to Dave Petraeus and Ray Odierno, who were managing the surge on the ground. But the Joint Chiefs had a slightly deeper perspective on this, and I think we're concerned that the politics in Iraq were not showing the kind of progress which would make these tactical effects durable. Okay? And to that point, I think, by and large, that's accurate. Now, they had another concern as well, and that was that the surge would Americanize the war in a way that would be unhelpful in a period where, remember, we had already been there 3.5 years, where American presence was creating antibodies. There were antibodies against the American presence. And many of the insurgent attacks were against us. So there was a concern that we could actually worsen the situation by increasing our presence and slow the transition to Iraqi forces, where the uniformed military believed the responsibility had to be moved. It had to be moved from an American Western fight to an Iraqi fight. And that process was underway at the time of the surge, and we were concerned, right, that this was going to set back the transition process. Now, in the end, I think we have to give the surge credit that it did stem the sectarian violence which was tearing Iraq apart at the time. On the other hand, I think we have to admit that it had a rather temporary effect, because it did not spark either the increased capability of the Iraqis. They were quite happy to see us do it, right? Nor did it end up, in the more telling measure, nor did it end up in transforming Iraqi politics. And so I remember at that time, in fact, so 6 months after the surge is when I went to the White House to work on Iraq. And at that time, we had 4 or 5 or 6, maybe John Wood will remember, although he was doing mostly Afghanistan on my team. We had 4, 5, or 6 benchmarks for Iraqi political progress. So this is the hydrocarbons law, the provincial powers law, and others here will remember. I can't remember all 5 of them. I have to go back and check my notes. By and large, they're unfulfilled to this day, right? And the result is that you have a Shia majority government, which is less sectarian than maybe some of its predecessors, but still has not come to grips with the fundamental political dynamics in Iraq, which make Iraq vulnerable to insurgents, to al-Qaeda in Iraq, today to ISIL. And so my concern is that Iraqis can liberate Mosul, but we haven't gotten at the underpinning problems that make Iraq vulnerable. And until we do, we can train Iraqi forces for all of our lifetime and add our kids' lifetimes to that, okay? And we'll continue to train them. But until we get to the politics of this, none of that training, none of that capacity will be very meaningful in terms of stabilizing Iraq.
Is Iraq sustainable? I mean, if this goes on, I just can't imagine that it goes on for your children and their children's lifetimes, that at some point Iraq doesn't erode from the weight of it.
Well, I mean, I think the Iraqi state is sustainable, but I think they're living on a bit of borrowed time in terms of they have to, and I believe this Iraqi government does, feel the urgency to get on with some of this hard business. But the politics there are enormously complex and gridlocked, stalemated. And unfortunately, there's very little room for anything but zero-sum political dealings. So if a deal is good for me or is good for my opponent, then it must be bad for me. And so I'll oppose it. And so you're at political stalemate. So is it sustainable? Sure. I don't think Iraq's going to break apart anytime soon. But you do wonder how a state goes on and on and on through waves of what for any other state would be existential violence. I mean, how many car bombs can Baghdad endure? Well, apparently quite a few, because they went through, remember, the whole insurgency while we were there. Then there was a bit of a lull after we left, but then al-Qaeda in Iraq was replaced by ISIL, some of the same people. Al-Baghdadi was an AQI guy, and now he's leading ISIL, right? And they're going through another wave of violence. And you read in the newspaper, today there were 3 or 4 car bombs in Baghdad, and a couple hundred people died, and tomorrow we're just back at work. I don't know. This is one of the things that still puzzles me after watching and observing Iraq now for a decade. I don't understand how that state can endure this level of violence and not fracture. But it does. It's amazingly durable.
All right, so to Afghanistan, America's longest war. The top U.S. commander has now asked for thousands of more troops. We have 8,400 there now, training Afghan forces and fighting terrorism. When you look at the, how long this has gone on, is Afghanistan winnable? And what does winning actually look like? And if you were advising the president, would you say to send more troops, and for how long? Would there be limits on it?
This is basically the question that we responded to year after year after year in the NSC. Should we send more troops? So look, there's some parallels here with Afghanistan, but with what I just said about Iraq, right? So what does success look like in Afghanistan? We've been pretty clear from the very outset that the goal is no more 9/11s, right? No safe haven for international terrorists. Now, in the, 15, going on 16 years that we've been there, our national objective has drifted from time to time. It started out as pretty clean cut. Get the guys who gave us 9/11, right? That's what took us in October of 2001. There was a period of time when we imagined that this is going to be perhaps simpler than it is, and that our goals could expand, and that we could, if I remember when I first got to the NSC and looked at the national objectives for Afghanistan, it was some of the adjectives in the objective statement were democratic, market-based economy, respect for the rule of law, and safe haven or safety for all minorities and genders. Okay, great. Okay, that objective defied anything that looked like Afghanistan. Okay, then after a while, we tried that objective on for size, not making progress, in fact, losing ground. And we eventually came back, I think, in 2009, when President Obama made it pretty clear after 2 strategic reviews of Afghanistan that the objective was again back on al-Qaeda. Now, there's a connection between al-Qaeda, the narrow objective, and the broader objective. If you can stabilize the state of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is self-sustaining, right, then it will deny safe haven to al-Qaeda, and we don't have to do it ourselves. So that's a bit of the stretch goal. I would argue that today we have achieved our objective in Afghanistan in the narrow sense. There's been no instance that I know of international terrorism being planned, plotted, commanded and controlled from Afghanistan, okay, since 9/11. So check, okay, no safe haven. Now, it doesn't mean there's no al-Qaeda operative in Afghanistan, but they're no danger to us or anybody else outside of the area in which they live, which is a pretty localized, and by the way, very, very remote area in Afghanistan. Now, ISIL has today a presence in Afghanistan. It's quite modest, okay? I don't know of any external plots coming from that ISIL presence in Afghanistan outside of the localized area. So in a sort of very realist, steely, cold-eyed view, we've attained our objective in Afghanistan. Now, if we want that to be sustained with no U.S. presence, then we've got a lot of work to do with the Afghan state. And this as much goes to this point about building military capacity, which, by the way, we've put something like $70 billion over the years into building an Afghan military. And this is against the Taliban, okay? The Taliban have no aircraft, no drones, almost no vehicles, except the ones they take from us, and so forth, right? I mean, this is a classic rural, poor insurgency, Pashtun-based insurgency. And we've poured tens of billions of dollars against it. The problem is that the military capacity we've built, and this is a little bit like my comment on Iraq, has not been coupled to political progress. And so you have this military out there, and it's fighting, but it's fighting in the midst of a government which can't deliver for the people, a government which is still driven by corruption, and I mean industrial scale corruption. I mean, Afghan military officers, senior military officers, buy their positions in many instances, pay for their positions. Why? Because they know once they're in position, they'll come out ahead, okay? They'll recoup the down payment, okay? Border crossing sites are big problems with regard to corruption and so forth. So until you get at those underlying root causes, until Afghanistan becomes a credible, a state with credible governance in which the people can rely, then we're going to be fighting the Taliban for a long time, or Afghans will be fighting the Taliban for a long time.
But the Taliban have also today taken 15% more territory than they had 2 years ago in 2015. I mean, that's really striking when you consider how limited their resources are compared with what we've given or sold the Afghans, what we have there, what NATO has had provided. And that's just a staggering fact.
But this demonstrates one of the realities of a fight like in Afghanistan, like that in Afghanistan. And that is that the Taliban have at their disposal tools, tactics, weapons that give them a huge advantage. Like the roadside bomb, okay? This is, in military jargon, the IED. I don't know why we didn't just call it the roadside bomb, but this is the improvised explosive device, right? This is the old artillery shell munition dud, which is rewired, placed on under the roadbed, and exploded when a government vehicle passes or one of our vehicles passes. IEDs, roadside bombs, caused 70% of U.S. casualties, combat casualties. So one technique caused 70% of the casualties. And that number, by the way, has stayed pretty much consistent, even though we poured tens of billions of dollars into an effort to try to counter these roadside bombs. Why? They're cheap. All the materials are reasonably available. It doesn't take a bomb scientist to plant this bomb. You can train, most of us in this room could be trained. I don't recommend it. When the bomb detonates, the guy who detonates the bomb walks away. It becomes an anonymous weapon. And he can do it again tomorrow. Okay? So for a decade and a half now, we've been fighting these guys and unable to counter this very asymmetric tool. Why is it asymmetric? Because the cost for him is very low, and the price for us is very high. So the cost-benefit ratio is completely in his favor, right? And so if you're deploying a bomb that costs $50 to build and detonate, and the guy who did it today can do it again tomorrow with almost anonymity, okay? You can spend a lot of billions trying to fight that asymmetric tool. The suicide bomber is, I mean, in a sort of a grotesque way, is another example of an asymmetric means, right? So one attacker dies, he takes 50 civilians or 10 soldiers with him. That's asymmetry. So the Taliban have this huge advantage. The other fundamental advantage they have and why they're able to counter an Afghan force at 350,000. The Taliban have always been in about the 25 to 30,000 range, right? We've fielded 10 times that number of Afghan security forces. Why is that? Well, I mean, why isn't that decisive? Because the Taliban can pick their time of attack. They have the initiative, right? And the Afghans have to defend everywhere. So 350,000 Afghan army and police spread across the country and a 30 million population is rather hard to defend. So, and by the way, the Taliban are a capable foe. I mean, this is not a ragtag, pickup team. They've been at it for a long time. They're quite good. But the asymmetry of their techniques and the initiative that they have, they can pick the time of attack, gives them huge battlefield advantages. And then finally, they're fueled by the fact that their image of Afghanistan is not at all the image of what they see in Afghanistan today. So they're driven, they have good tactics, they have asymmetric means, and they have the initiative. Those are weighty advantages for the Taliban.
Okay, so I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We advertise this as the conflicts of today and tomorrow. So I want you to look ahead a little bit. What are the next threats, the next crises down the road? What's the next generation of threats? What are the characteristics of those conflicts? And how do we adapt to them?
Okay, so this is actually the question I prepared for because it's what the title says, right? so it's good. I'm happy that we're getting there. So I think if we look forward, now let's just take a 10-year window, right? If the last 10 years are prologue to the next, right? And we don't have a cataclysmic change, then I think the 10 years that we face will be characterized by three trends. Okay, trend number one. I think that the scale and scope of conflicts in the next 10 years will stay below open, overt, state-on-state conflict. Okay? So imagine a threshold of conventional war, which is state-on-state. What I'm saying is that, and maybe this won't come as such a stark prediction, that most of what we'll face in the next decade will be below that threshold. So I don't expect too many state-on-state invasions here, right?
So it's state against non-state actors.
It's state against non-state actors. It's internal conflicts, so civil war, insurgencies, terrorist attacks, but internal conflicts. And then there's another variant, and that is conflicts where an external actor, a state, sponsors instability in another state. So here, think hybrid warfare is the term we use at NATO, but this is misinformation campaigns, this is hacking of political parties, this is
elections.
This is, yeah, so yeah, you want to know what hybrid warfare looks like? I mean, in my book, it looks like the hacking of the U.S. political process. But by the way, this isn't the only place in the NATO alliance where that kind of cyber activity is taking place. It's taking place elsewhere. There are campaigns across Europe today, in the Netherlands and France in a couple months, later in Germany this year, all of which are going to be subject to that kind of external influence. So, but all of this, right, whether it's a civil war or it's an insurgency or it's sort of destabilizing, malign influence from one state into the activities, internal activities in another, are all tucked in below this threshold of conventional armed attack. Why is that? First of all, it's because our conventional forces are quite good. And I still think we live on the reputation and the demonstrated capability of American armed forces that goes all the way back to the first Gulf War. Okay? But yes, the overthrow of the Taliban was another demonstration. The race on Baghdad in 2003 was another demonstration. People are not, they're not going to take us on face to face. So I think there's a conventional deterrent effect which establishes a threshold. And most of what we're going to see in the next 10 years is below that. Okay, so that's characteristic number one. Characteristic number two has to do with this asymmetric tools that I mentioned. those are going to be the dominant tools in the next 10 years, right? Now, you may have some exceptions. You may have, North Korea doesn't look very asymmetric if it develops an ICBM, or Iran, an ICBM, or something like that. But most of the tools are going to be tools of terror, tools of asymmetric things like roadside bombs, suicide bombers, and that sort of thing. Why? Again, cost-benefit analysis is in the hands of the attacker. That's good news for the attacker. Second of all, they're anonymous. So do we really know who did the hacking here in the United States? Well, we have some ideas. There's some forensics there, right? But are we actually holding people accountable so that others will be deterred and won't do it again? I'm not sure we're at that level. So below the threshold, asymmetric weapons. And here's the third one. This one it might spark some questions. I think most of these conflicts will fall below the threshold of vital U.S. national interests. There'll be things that we're interested in. And there may be some of these internal conflicts that are important to us. But I don't see on the horizon much prospect for an attack or an outbreak of violence which rises to the vital national interest category. Why is that? Again, I think we have to remember, we have to remind ourselves that our strategic nuclear deterrent posture and the deterrent effect of the best military, the best Navy, the best Air Force, the best Army, the best Special Forces, which resides in this country today, has a suppressive effect on state-on-state violence. So I don't expect open conflict with an ascending power like China. I don't expect open conflict with Russia. I don't think Russia intends to invade NATO. Why? Because the first tank they bump into is an M1 Abrams tank with combat crewed by guys who are all wearing right shoulder patches because they've been in combat together. And that's not a fight Russia wants to pick. Okay? So I give a lot of credit to something that I think many Americans miss, and that is this deterrent value of the forces that we have in place today. Now, look, we can get better, and there's some investment opportunities here in our nuclear forces and in our conventional forces that reinforce this threshold or this deterrent barrier, right? And keep the upcoming conflicts below the threshold and below U.S. vital interests. Now, here's the challenge. When we choose, as we have occasionally in the past, to deploy our world-class, nobody can match us conventional capabilities into one of these conflicts, which is internal to some nation state, which is maybe sponsored by another nation state, but it's below vital national interests. So we're now getting down into lesser interests, important interests, or just interesting interests, right? We do that at considerable risk because those are not the fights that our forces are built to fight. We typically we run the risk of deploying into situations we don't understand. Sometimes the presence of 100 or 150,000 troops like our troops actually contribute more to the problem than they do the solution. Now, that's not what was intended, but it's because of cultural, geographic, political, sometimes ethnic factors that so complicate the situation that we should be very, very wary of deploying this world-class conventional force into unconventional situations. I think if anything reflects, if the history of the last, 15 years reflects anything, is that when you put 100,000, and so I pick 100,000 because that was the peak of U.S. forces in Afghanistan in 2010, 2011. Actually, there were 140,000 Western forces under a NATO flag. Or in Iraq, the peak was, I think, at 170 Western forces. When you put that presence of conventional forces, who by and large were not organized, trained, and equipped, they weren't built to do that task, and you put them in an environment which is as foreign to them as the other side of the moon, and you keep them there on one-year tours and expect them to master the situation and contribute to the solution, quite frankly, that's in my experience, that is an unrealistic expectation. So we should separate carefully what's vital to our security, what our vital interests are, and what are sub-vital. And if we get into that lesser category, we should be very, very prudent and cautious about deploying forces. So, for example, if you gave me a choice between the model that we're using in Iraq and Syria today, which is relatively low profile, small footprint, special operations forces centric, providing things to the Iraqi forces that the Iraqis simply don't have, like precision fires and so forth, for world-class medical evacuation capability and so forth. To the other model, the other extreme of the model, which is in sort of 2007, 2008, 170,000 Westerners doing it for the Iraqis. I pick today's model. I think for the reasons I've outlined, it's got a much higher prospect of success. So the three trends, mostly below the threshold of vital national interests, so internal conflicts, external sponsorship, hacking, that kind of thing. Mostly asymmetric tools, okay? And mostly not involving U.S. vital national interests. Now, that doesn't mean no interest, but not vital. Okay?
That's great. I'd press you on specific countries, but I will leave it to questioners. Let's start here. Do we have microphones to be passed around? And please identify yourself.
Andrew Pierre. Is this on? Okay. That was a terrific discussion. Thank you very much. It shows your military background and skills as well as your political skills as an ambassador and so on. I'd like to take the discussion we had of Europe at a slightly different level, maybe a more political level. There are winds of change in Europe right now, like what we had last night and this morning here. In many countries, as you well know, important elections coming up in France, in Germany, Brexit in the UK. There are governments which are shifting in Poland, Hungary, other parts of Central Europe. The Baltic states seem a little stable, but these winds of change are leading to what is termed populism. Some might argue that we're now having a growth of populism right here in the United States. And this raises the question, I think, of how we look at NATO. You put an emphasis on sort of less vital parts of our interests. But I would assume, but you can disagree with this, that we should view NATO as absolutely vital. But it's not clear that outside of the military, then the political forces in Europe, and maybe this country also, will come to that same judgment. And if that's the case, are we really facing a situation where we are eroding public support on both sides of the Atlantic for NATO, and the situation in which the Russians could certainly take advantage of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, let me affirm that, yes, I think that the NATO alliance is above the threshold. It's worth fighting for. In fact, we have an internationally binding legal commitment by way of the Washington Treaty. I mean, that's what a treaty means, right? That if one of the other 27 is attacked, we are obliged to respond and the treaty actually says how we would go about doing that. So, yes, that's worthwhile. I mean, I think Jim Mattis said, this is a line I wish I had thought of as the NATO ambassador, but Jim Mattis said it first in his testimony. He said, look, if we didn't have a NATO, we would have to create one. We would have to invent one. So I'm quite happy that we have one, and that our forefathers, sorry ladies, they were all fathers at that point, in 1949, crafted this thing. It's an amazing organization. And as I said in my opening remarks, it's also proven amazingly durable because it has gone through distinct phases and it has found its way through those phases. So, vital, NATO, no question. I agree with you that institutions like NATO and like the European Union, but not only those, I mean, other American institutions below the federal government, many of these are coming into question. People seem to be in a very questioning mood these days, and wondering whether some of these older 67-year-old like NATO institutions are worth their weight. And are they just bureaucracies? You know, have they just endured because they were there and they'll be there tomorrow and so forth? I actually think for NATO, as long as it continues to adapt and doesn't prove itself obsolete, and I think I've made the case that it is not today obsolete, and as long as it remembers that its center of gravity, the essence of NATO, is solidarity at 28, then NATO will be okay. I'm going to contrast it with the EU here in a second. The key here is that NATO's mandate is relatively narrow. And it's a narrow mandate on which the 28, and it's a pretty diverse group of 28. I mean, think of the diversity between Erdogan's Turkey and Theresa May's UK, or Justin Trudeau's Canada and one of the Baltic states. I mean, this is a pretty diverse group, or Italy and Norway, right? So what pins it together? A simple one-line pledge, which is, if I'm attacked, I have 27 best buddies, okay? And it's a narrow scope. I mean, we don't take on the euro, we don't try to get common trade, we don't try to get common immigration policy, we don't try to get a common currency, we don't do all that. The EU, on the other hand, has much broader aspirations. Its organizational mandate includes all those things I mentioned and many other things. So labor restrictions, labor laws, trade, finances, road signs, I mean, everything, right? So the EU's task is much, much more difficult. And I think what we saw with Brexit, and maybe what we'll see in the coming years in the wake of Brexit, are increasing sort of centrifugal forces in the EU, forces that cause the EU member states to wonder whether they're getting their value for membership in the EU, and whether the balance between the responsibilities of the center, the EU in Brussels, and the member states in the 28, soon to be 27, when the UK leaves, in the 27 capitals, whether that mix is right. Who does what? And I think the EU is going to go through a bit of a self-reckoning, a self-examination, an introspection of whether they have this balance right. I don't, however, so having just spent 3.5 years in NATO headquarters, we're not gazing in the mirror at NATO headquarters. I mean, we know what NATO's about. We're quite rock solid on our commitment. We accept the diversity across the 28 democracies. I mean, there's a lot of diversity there. You mentioned some of it. We continually remind ourselves of these founding values I pointed out. But there's room inside those democratic values for different flavors of democracy. And we see some of that playing out today. So I'm with you. And I guess in sum, I'm not fearful about the sort of fracturing or flying apart of NATO because of its narrow mandate and its foundation on values. I do think that Brexit is a warning sign to the EU that it needs, that project deserves some introspection.
Just a minute, I have a question I've been asked to put to you from Eric Schmidt at the New York Times. Turkey says it will not accept Syrian Kurds, the YPG, as part of the force to reclaim Raqqa from ISIS. What other alternatives exist to defeat ISIS in Raqqa, but also preserve U.S.-Turkish relations?
Well, look, if I had to answer that question, I'd be, the CENTCOM commander, but Joe Votel has that job. So look, I think that a fundamental discussion early in this administration will be between Washington and Ankara about, and with the other key coalition members who make up the 65-nation coalition, about the way ahead. And I don't have a fixed opinion with regard to the Syrian Kurds. Right now, they're one of the more capable forces on the ground in northern Syria, so they're attractive in that way. But if you're President Erdogan, obviously, he has a different view on this, and I don't have an independent judgment in terms of the YPG. So Eric's going to be disappointed in my answer. But the reality is, you got to use the forces you have. But on the other hand, you don't want the coalition to fly apart because of fundamental disagreement, like the use of the Syrian Kurdish forces. So this will be an early, intense conversation between the United States and Turkey when that part of the bilateral relationship kicks off here. But again, we got to give this administration a little time. It's 2.5 weeks.
Okay, in the back, and then there was a woman here, so let's do it in that order.
Hi, Chuck Woolery, a former chair of the United Nations Association Council of Organizations. I really thank you for your history on leading up to that, and really excited about to hear what you were prepared for, the advances. What I'm curious about, I've been looking at the evolution of weaponry now for probably 30 years. I'm a biologist by training, and now the convergence of things like bioweaponry, drones, IEDs, it seems like our mentality in addressing the threats we face are not keeping up with the advances in technology. And that we, as a very complex society, are extremely vulnerable in many respects. If it's an economic issue, if it's a biological issue, that we stand to lose a lot with a very small investment on their part, like the IED thing. I just want to know if you think that far ahead.
That's a clean restatement of my premise, that these asymmetric tools, and I didn't mention biological weapons, but those are potentially on the list of asymmetric tools as well. They have this sort of undeniable battlefield advantage. And it is, first of all, this cost-benefit ratio, right? They tend to always favor the attacker. And then the second, this question of you can live to fight a second day. So it's not just a one-time attack because they tend to be anonymous. So you can imagine you've probably studied examples of the potential use of biological weapons that are hugely advantageous to the attacker, but in terms of cost and benefit, and which will be very hard to attribute to the attacker. But cyber attacks, look, these hacking incidents also fall in that category. So it's a very diverse set of tools, from the roadside bomb to a potential biological to internet hacking, that really, in a way, defy defense. And you're right, we're not where we need to be on this thing. Now, why are we there? We're there, first of all, because technology enables some of these tools, right? So internet hacking didn't exist, 10 or 15, 20 years ago. But also because nobody wants to confront us face to face. And we shouldn't, I guess my major point this afternoon is we shouldn't discount the value of that, because at least we're not being challenged conventionally. And at least we're not being threatened with nuclear weapons. Why? Because we're quite good at that, right? So we've forced the competition below this threshold, which is it's not very comforting, but at least we're not dealing with the even worse situations above the threshold.
And there was a woman here.
Hi. Hello? Okay.
You are?
My name's Elizabeth. I'm a student at Georgetown. And I wanted to go back to your earlier discussion on Iraq. So you sort of mentioned how you were sort of surprised at how long Iraq could last throughout all this, these many years of violence. And sort of a thought that flew through my head was well, obviously they've survived because the U.S. has wanted it to survive and it supported it. But, the converse of that is that if the U.S. doesn't support Iraq, then it would maybe completely dissolve. So my sort of two-part question is, does Iraq only exist because of U.S. support? And if that is the case, should the U.S. just continue to support Iraq indefinitely, or should it use kind of the same regime-changing power it had to, I guess, take out Saddam Hussein and reconstitute the borders of the Iraqi region into more stable units?
So, in my view, Iraq exists as it does today, and it has little to do with the United States. So I think I might have a slightly different view on this. I think the dominant factors in terms of the shape that Iraq's in today and the potential for stability and coherence as an Iraqi state has, frankly, only on the margins anything to do with the United States of America and what we choose to do and what we choose not to do. It has mostly to do with Iraqis. And this is my point about being rather sober. I'm not suggesting you're not. Being rather suspicious of and suspect of notions that we can go to a place, the United States could go into a place like Iraq, with our understanding of Iraq and all the cultural, political, geographic, historical, regional dimensions of that complex puzzle, and engineer and deliver an outcome. Americans, after the last 15 years, ought to be damn careful about reaching that conclusion. Okay, now, I'm not suggesting that was yours.
That's what we're doing now, though, right?
Well, no, I don't think so. I would argue that when we send 170,000 American troops to suppress an Iraqi insurgency, right, we're kind of taking it on ourselves to engineer an outcome. I would argue today when we send several thousand U.S. troops in a low-profile way, in a way where, we probably tragically lost fewer than 10 soldiers in Iraq last year, right? Where if the Iraqis don't take an action, frankly, nothing happens. That's the model that puts the burden where it belongs, which is on the Iraqi armed forces to deliver an outcome. But more important than that, more important than what comes at the end of a gun, is what happens in Baghdad. So we can't want these things. We can't want an outcome. We can't design an outcome and want it more than they do. If we did, that's called colonization. And the world tried that for a generation or so, and that didn't work so well. And I'm not recommending that. So I guess what I'm after here is the point is that the indigenous, authentic Iraqi solution will be durable, whatever it is, will be durable and sustainable well beyond anything we can influence.
Okay.
And that's where I'm at after 10 years of watching this.
We only have 10 minutes left, so let me take 3 questions and then let Doug answer them. We'll take one here. And one.
Thank you. Scott Worden, I direct the Afghanistan and Central Asia program here at USIP.
Oh, that's easy.
I want to ask what you think is both the future and the need for democracy and governance work and programming in the next 10 years. And I want to amplify that by noting that you started by underscoring the value of freedom and democracy in the NATO Charter. You noted the maybe mission creep or overreach in our democratic ambition in Afghanistan, and you just talked about the centrality of getting inclusive politics right as a sustainable solution for Iraq. Against all that, I think that there's going to be a nostalgia in this administration, or among others, for can we just have strongman rule in this area, and that kept a lid on it for many decades. And so that's kind of out there as the alternative. And I wonder, how do you evaluate those contrasting examples, and what is, absent strong military force, the democratic and governance approach to this?
And the man with glasses here. And who else had a question? Let me find it. Yeah, back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nebojša Kalođerović. I'm ambassador of Montenegro to the UN, to the United States. Sorry, I was there before this. Well, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. General, when I was thinking how to address you, whether I should call you Mr. Ambassador or Mr. General. I think that I should address you in both capacities because your lecture fits both capacities really very well. And thank you very much for inspiring lecture and the conversation that we had. I have plenty of questions that I would really like to ask, but I will focus only on one. I fully share your thoughts about adaptability of NATO, in particular in the last 25 years, and a certain comparison of the situation 25 years ago and all the challenges that NATO and the whole Europe and the world faced at that time, and the current ones that you explained. And one of the policy that has proven as a successful one is open door policy of NATO. I hope that next time in similar occasion when we see you, you will be talking about 29 members of NATO rather than 28. So I would like just to ask you, how do you view now, given the adaptability of this very important organization, the future open door policy?
Thanks. And one more in the back here. Oh, well, that's all right. Never mind. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Ramin Manavi. I'm counselor at the Afghan embassy here.
Which embassy?
I have Afghan embassy in DC. I have two questions. One is on Afghanistan and the other
make
is on
them quick.
Sure. I want to know your thoughts on the issue of NATO being obsolete. So what do you think of the logic behind this issue?
He addressed that at the beginning of our meeting.
No, I want him to, clarify what are his, proposals for the structural change in NATO. That some of them needs to be highlighted, I think. And also, when it comes to Afghanistan, you know that our region is highly concentrated by almost over 20 terrorist groups. And it was stated by General Nicholson recently that around the world there are almost 100 terrorist groups, and there are almost 20 of them centered in that area. So what do you think how NATO could approach and dealing with these terrorist groups, and also dealing with the countries that are state sponsors of terrorists in that area? You discussed the situation in Afghanistan and the Taliban being fighting against the government.
We'll have to leave it there.
The external support for the Taliban is an issue that's really, of highly concern for the Afghan government. Thank you so much for.
So let me just take these in reverse order. So NATO's not obsolete, and I think we made that case early on. So there, and I don't know, I've not asked Mick Nicholson, the U.S. commander in Afghanistan, to account for the 20 out of 100 and so forth. But my observation is there has not, I don't know of a terrorist group that could be resident, that is resident in Afghanistan today, that since 9/11 has sponsored an attack outside of Afghanistan. So and maybe we can talk about this later. I'm sorry?
I meant in the region, not Afghanistan.
Yeah, okay, but yeah, so my statement, however, is confined to Afghanistan. And when we look at U.S. objectives in Afghanistan, I think that's an important data point to understand that al-Qaeda has not struck from inside Afghanistan outside, which is why we went to Afghanistan. On Montenegro, I agree with you. The next time we meet, could we just agree that there are 29 members? That would be good. And of course, everyone should know this is in front of the U.S. Senate now. It's been voted out of committee. The process here is that when the treaty is amended, because we add a member, and it's only happened 6 times before, so this would be the 7th occasion since 1949, right? The treaty actually gets changed, right? And so it has to go through the same process as when the treaty came into effect originally. So all current members have to go through their constitutional process, as we're doing now, just up Pennsylvania Avenue by way of Senate ratification. I'm confident that's going to happen. And I'm also confident that the U.S. position on this will not have changed across the divide of the two administrations. So I think we're going to be okay with that. I agree with you. I think NATO enlargement, so the move from 16 members in 89-91 to 28 today, has been a success story. Why? First of all, because it has brought 100 million Europeans under the NATO flag. And why is that important? Not because it's 100 million soldiers or military capacity entirely, but these are 100 million people who now live under democracy. And in some cases, they're still emerging democracies. And in all cases, they are imperfect democracies, like ours. Okay? But the point is, they signed up for the second sentence. Okay? And that's been, I think, an aspirational impact on democracies in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. But it's been a motivational tool. And I will tell you that in NATO headquarters, the most active, the most vocal, the most vibrant members among the 28 ambassadors include most of the Central and Eastern European allies who are damn glad to be in NATO today, especially when they see what's happening to the east. I don't think open door is going to go away. Why? Because it's in the treaty. Just so you know, it turns out that it's Article 10. And it says that the alliance shall remain open, thus the open door title, right? It should remain open to European democracies that reflect the values, so you got to get through the values check, right? And are able to contribute to the collective defense. And then finally it states that the vote at the end of the day has to be unanimous. So we're after 28 current members agreeing that Montenegro should be 29, and I'm comfortable it's going to happen. And then over here to Afghanistan. And this broader question of, on the one hand, we can build security forces. We kind of know how to do that. But do we really know, do we have counterpart knowledge and ability on the governance and democracy side? And frankly, I leave my last 10 years of experience not optimistic that we can, I think we have the expertise, but I don't think we have all the tools in place. And mostly what I'm concerned about is that we try to apply tools and expertise that we imagine will be effective in places like USIP and just across the street in Foggy Bottom and so forth, right? But these are U.S. ideas. These are U.S. concepts. These are U.S. engineering techniques. And the places that we're applying them to defy U.S. models. I guess, and the underlying problem here is our ability to understand the local settings in a way that enable our achieving our objectives, rather than enable stalemate, or actually in some cases enable countering our objectives, being sort of self-defeating. And the challenge here, I think, quite candidly, is that the personnel systems, the interagency system here in this city does not give me a lot of confidence that we know that we can master the problem set with enough granularity, enough feeling for the problem that would enable us to make inroads on governance. I got to tell you, that's my experience in Afghanistan and Iraq. We kind of know how to build an army. Now, the reality is we try to build an army just like ours, which is also impossible. Okay, but let's set that problem aside, right? We really don't, I think, know well, and we don't have the tools assembled. We don't have the mastery of the subjects to get at something that's one or two orders of magnitude more difficult than building an army, which is building a credible, representative, durable political outcome. And as long as the politics lag a generation behind the military, right, what you're going to see, and as I predicted in one of my trends, is more and more internal instability, right, that just aims for stalemate. You know, the Iraqis will liberate Mosul, and ISIL will become son of ISIL. and it'll pop its head up somewhere else. You can pick the provinces. Anbar would be a nice guess. By the way, how's the rebuilding of Ramadi and Fallujah going today? Okay? Well, I'll tell you, the roots of the son of ISIL are in Ramadi and Fallujah, which have already been liberated, okay? But in the course of the liberation, they were destroyed, okay? So until you get at that cycle, which fundamentally has to do with the harder task, which is politics, governance, rule of law, then we'll be training Iraqi forces, and this is my prediction, my 12-year-old daughter will be training Iraqi forces someday, okay? Because it's an unending cycle until we get at the root problem. So there's good. So if this is your line of work, there's a lot of work, and it's going to be tough. It'll be tough going, but it's vital.
Doug, let me first of all say how lucky we have been to have you in the service of the United States for all these years.
Well, these things didn't all turn out so well. So.
Well, you've given it your best efforts, and we're so grateful today for you to appear your first time since coming back from NATO at U.S. Institute of Peace. Really a breathtaking analysis of the world, the threats we face. And please join me in thanking Doug. Thank you.